Welcome to Course Correct, presented by Charter Impact, the place for impactful student data insights.
Hello everyone, I'm Michels, Director of Student Data Services here at Charter Impact. On this edition of our Course Correct series, we're talking all things end-of-year CALPADS for the 24-25 school year. Today, we'll discuss what data are reported during the end-of-the-year process, who should be included in that process, what the timelines and deadlines are associated with the submission, and most importantly, why the end-of-year submission matters, including some implications for state and federal reporting. Let's jump right in by discussing what data we report during this end-of-year or EOY submission. Remember that the CALPADS EOY submission, it is a cumulative snapshot. It's not based on any specific date and time like some of the other CALPADS submissions are. There are 4 data collections that are associated with the end-of-year submission. The state defines those as EOY 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, actually, these submissions are changing next year, and we'll come back to those changes a little bit later. But for this year, you can imagine these 4 data collections as 4 buckets of work, all of which occur during this end-of-year submission process. In the end-of-year 1 bucket, we have information about courses and career readiness. That's whenever we submit course completion information, CTE participants and completers, as well as work-based learning. In the end-of-year 2 bucket, it's kind of all about programs, including students that are receiving 504 accommodations, armed forces family members, and there are a few other programs that are included in that submission. In the end-of-year 3 bucket, it's a lot about student demographics and outcomes. So this includes student incidences or kind of discipline-related items, cumulative enrollment, and some other student indicators. We'll look at that one in more detail a little later on. And then lastly, the end-of-year 4, EOY 4 bucket, is all about special education and students with disabilities. For those of you who are not super familiar with CALPADS submissions, there are several file types that are submitted during each cycle. And those file types are typically represented by a 4-letter code. So you can see some examples here. Those file types are then processed and in some cases combined in the CALPADS system to produce snapshot reports. Snapshot reports are those reports that provide sometimes summary information or student lists, depending on the report. And those snapshot reports are also sometimes referred to by their number. So you may hear things like 1.1 or 1.18, or sorry, 1.18, 1.18. So let's take a little closer look at the EOY 1 data collected. As you can see, there are 5 file types submitted with this collection, and first up is the staff demographics, the SDEM. The SDEM file is all about the staff, and so for EOY, we're mostly concerned with teacher demographics and teacher assignments. Next, we have the course section completion, the CRSC. For EOY, the CRSC file includes information about your state course codes and other course attributes. Now, I do want to pause here and mention that if you are familiar with CALPADS, we do submit some of this information, or we do submit staff and course information in Fall 2. Fall 2, the purpose of that submission is completely separate from EOY, and what I mean by that is the courses that were submitted are in Fall 2 are not compared to the submission for EOY. Those things don't kind of connect. It's a whole separate submission. Third, we have the student course completion, the SCSC. Now, we have course section completion. That's all the information about the courses that were completed at your school within a year. The student course completion file is, okay, now I am Michels, and here are the however many courses I completed this year. Here's my grade, the credits that I earned, my Carnegie units. In order to have a record in the student level, there has to exist a course in the course file. So those things do kind of go together. And then the last 2 we have are very aptly named. We have the student CTE file, SCTE, which has information about CTE. And then we have work-based learning, which again, aptly named. It includes information about work-based learning things such as hours and internships. So then how does all that EO1 collection data inform state and federal reporting? We're not going to go into each of these, but the big takeaway is that the data that we submit in EOY always has, usually at a minimum, it has implications to DataQuest, it has implications to the dashboard, and in many cases it has federal implications which can impact funding sometimes. So for example, in EOY 1, the CTE and the course information that is used for DataQuest and the dashboard. So if, for example, you did not submit or certify that information, you would not see CTE data on DataQuest, and you would not have any data to inform the CCI indicator on your dashboard. Federally, if you didn't submit your CTE information, of course, that has Perkins funding connections. And then there are some connections to the Migrant Student Information Exchange as well. Now let's move on to end of year EOY 2. In end of year 2, if you remember EOY 1, there were 5 file types. End of year 2 includes only one file type, and that's the student program file, the SPRG. The information from the student program file in EOI2 has federal and state connections, so we're reporting specific information about students for both of those reasons. So specifically, in the federal realm, we submit information about Title I, Part A Basic and Part A Neglected, and Armed Forces family members, and that informs federal regulations and requirements. On the state side, we are reporting information about 504 accommodations, the Opportunity Program, the California Partnership Academy, and then, of course, pregnant and parenting programs, as you can see here. So just the takeaway here is that the student programs do have, we are reporting in the same file for both state and federal types of programs. And so if you remember from our last, in EOI1, we talked about the implications. So you can see here there are some very clear implications because these are so clearly connected to state and federal reporting. However, here they are kind of laid out a little bit more explicitly. Of course, at the state level, those state-specific programs that are reported in places such as DataQuest, if you, for some reason, didn't report that information, you would not see that information in DataQuest. And then federally, of course, there are ties to some of the federal reports and the federal funding. All right, let's move on to EOI3. And I said earlier that it was a bigger bucket. It is, in my head, a bigger bucket because there are more file types. End of year 3, we start with the student incidences. There's actually 3 file types that are related to student incidences, or as I think about it in my head, just like discipline. So there is the student incidents file, the SINC, the student incident results file, so what happened as a result of the incident was the action taking, that's SIRS, and then a specific information about the student offenses, which is the SOF. SINC, SIRS, and SOF are all of the files related to student incidences. Of course, there is the student enrollment file, the SENR, and if you are a CALPADS person, you probably are very familiar with this file because it's one that we tend to update throughout the year to ensure our enrollment is accurately represented in the system. But at the end of the year, the SENR file is concerned with the cumulative enrollment, and in that file, it's also when you report graduates and completers, which is used to calculate the one-year grad rate. The third file that you see here is student absenteeism. We call that the STAS. That includes the absence summary, and the information submitted in that file is used to calculate your chronic absenteeism rate for the year. And that's the rate, that rate appears on the dashboard as well as in DataQuest, calculated in different ways depending on your situation, but it does appear in both places. And the last 2 files here, we submit information about homeless students using the SPRG file. Now you might be saying we already submitted SPRG in EOI2. We did, but we submitted, what we certified in EOI2 was not homeless. We certified those other programs that we had listed. Same file type, but we certify homeless information for end of year 3. And then last but not least, we have the English Language Acquisition, the CELA. This is one where in the end of year, we're more concerned about ensuring that we have indicated the students who are reclassified during the year. So your RFEP students, they should be reported correctly for this submission. Before we talk about state and federal reporting for the EOI3, I want to call out a few important tidbits related to end of year 3, the end of year 3 bucket. One of them that is pretty important is to know the difference between the grad rate, the one-year grad rate that's calculated, and the adjusted cohort grad rate. We're not going to go into the calculation itself, but I do want to call out something that relates to the submission. So the 4-year adjusted graduation rate, there are cohort reports available in CALPADS. But the data that informs the actual final cohort grad rate is pulled from ODS, and ODS is the operational data store. That data is pulled this year on August the 15th. August the 15th is a week after we finish the CALPADS end of year submission. What does that mean? What that means is if Kat Michels was marked as a graduate on, let's say, August the 10th, I would not have been captured in the EOI3 bucket that we talked about just a second ago because that bucket was due already and the amendment window closed on the 8th. I graduated on the 10th. So I'm not included in that count or that report. But when ODS comes and they pull the information for the cohort grad rate on August 15th, I am going to be in that piece of information. So depending on when you graduate students, sometimes there's a misalignment there. I like things to match. So if you're like me, if you want to try your best to make sure those things align, then ensure that you graduate all your students, especially if you can graduate your summer grads. Take care of that before August 8th of this year. That's when the amendment window closes. And so graduating them will ensure that they're reflected in the EOI3 submission and that ODS pull that happens later on in August. Another thing we want to flag here for you is school incident reporting. LEAs must have policies and procedures in place to identify and document and report incidences involving restraint and seclusion for students, specifically students with disabilities. And so that data must be reported. Now, typically, whenever we have these conversations, usually there's a question about what restraint and seclusion means. So we have included that information for you here. So Ed Code does define restraint and seclusion. There's a mechanical restraint, physical restraint, and then of course seclusion. This definition is the way that the state interprets and looks for the restraint and seclusion documentation. The reason that we want to highlight the restraint and seclusion information is because the Special Education Division uses the restraint seclusion information to determine who needs to undergo additional monitoring or provide additional documentation. So LEAs that have more than a 2-to-1 ratio of restraint seclusion per pupil, you may be asked to perform additional record reviews. And then if you have more than 100 students with disabilities, but you report 0 incidences, you also may have to undergo some additional activities or provide additional information. So it's just something to keep in mind, especially for schools with a higher population of students with disabilities. Now, let's circle back to the data implications for end of year 3. And this may be a little bit tiny on your screen, but again, the big takeaway is that this information informs your DataQuest, your California dashboard. Failure to certify or provide information would mean that you might have 0 counts on DataQuest. Federally, that would mean you would have 0 counts on some of the required reporting. And so it's just negative results if you do not certify. So definitely want to get that information in and make sure it is as accurate as possible. All right, let's move on to EOI 4. Remember that EOI 4 is all about special education. So it includes information about students who are receiving special education services. It includes information about students who are not participating. And then it also includes information about students who have graduated and what their post-secondary status is, only for students with disabilities. So there are a few data types that support this information. There's the status, students with disabilities status, the meetings, the plan, and the services. And so if you are involved in students with disabilities work, you are familiar with what these things are. Is the student receiving services, information about the meetings held, information on the student's plan, and then what specifics about the services they're receiving. And the file types are the same, both for participants, those who are receiving SPED services, and those who are not, or who have been exited for whatever reason during the year. The third one is the post-secondary status, the PSTS file. And basically what that is reporting on the post-secondary outcomes. So did the student go on to gain employment? Are they enrolled in a college university? There's some other outcomes listed on the survey. And the state actually has a template for the survey. The link is provided here. But you're just gathering that information and reporting it out. So the implications for the data here is, as you would expect for students with disabilities or anything related to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, you would have no data for monitoring, and it could have implications at the federal level as well. So it's important to ensure that your SPED data is submitted properly. We want to talk now a little bit about the 25-26 changes. So earlier I mentioned how there are the 4 buckets, the EOI 1, 2, 3, and 4. Next year, the state will actually move away from EOI 1, 2, 3, 4. There will be 2 submissions, EOI 1 and EOI 2. EOI 1 will basically be the current EOI 2, 3, and 4. So it's going to include student programs, the student incident, like the demographic and incidences, the enrollment, the absences, and the SPED data. That will now be EOI 1. The only thing that will not be included, which is the graduates and completers, which is currently a part of EOI 3. That's going to be moved to be included with the end of year 2 submission. The end of year 2 submission will be end of year 2 next year. It's currently end of year 1. Stay with me on this journey. I promise. I hope it pays off. And it's basically going to include everything from EOI 1, course completion, CTE, work-based learning, and then they're going to add the grads and completers. Here is, well, first of all, before we go into why it matters, the way that I'm keeping it straight in my head is that the new EOI 2 includes outcomes that in my head are mostly about high school, like secondary education, right? You've got your course completion, your student course completion, grades and credits and Carnegie units, grads, completers, CTE. Those are all kind of, in my head, secondary things. So that's how I'm keeping it straight. And the other buckets are all grades, right? K-12, your incidences and your programs and your SPED data, that's everybody. The EOI 1 bucket, which is now going to be EOI 2, is a lot of secondary data. And here's why that matters. The deadline for the end of year 1 window is going to be July 17th. That's basically the same as it is now, mid to late July. the end of year, and then it'll have an amendment window, and the amendment window will close on July 31st. That's kind of the same as it is now. End of year 2, those secondary outcomes, that certification deadline will be later. It'll be August 17th, and they will pull the cohort data on August 17th. The reason for this is because that takes care of the misalignment we talked about earlier in terms of when I report and I count as a graduate and as the grads and completers, as opposed to the cohort grad rate, and how sometimes those things can be misaligned. This handles that, because now the end of year 1 submission, the end of year 2 submission, that high school-esque submission, will be certified August 17th, the same day that the cohort data is pulled from ODS. So it will help out with that. Another good thing about the change is that it gives schools more time to review that course completion, CTE, and other information. All right, let's move on into the timeline and the teams. Part of ensuring a successful CALPADS submission is ensuring that you have the right people at the table helping review some of the information. Once you have those people assembled, you just want to make sure that you're hitting all of the aspects of each of those buckets of work, EOI 1 through 4. And different people may need to collaborate and come together. So for example, this is some examples of the people that may be involved in the process. Your school might look different, but you'll need someone looking at attendance data and making sure that's good to go. You'll need someone looking at your course information, the CTE information, your work-based learning information. Of course, you'll need whoever the expert is in like your 504, who may be involved in all the program information, your EL people for the RFEP, the reclassification information. Of course, your SPED people would be part of it as well. So it is a team effort that goes into making sure that your data is submitted not just on time and error-free, but also it's important to ensure that your data is accurate. So having a team of people to support in that review process is very helpful. Once you have the right people at the table, then it's about having a good process for getting your data ready to submit. So you want to start with reviewing errors from CALPADS, those file types that are submitted. Sometimes there's an error. Maybe there was a student who was submitted, but for some reason the course information didn't submit. Maybe the course information didn't submit because there was missing a teacher was missing a demographic indicator. Like all the files kind of correlate. Sometimes the errors go together. So you want to review and address those discrepancies. You also want to ensure that you're reviewing those snapshot reports, the reports that CALPADS provides that has the student information, the summary information. The team should be looking at that information, give it a glance, review it from both angles, not just the error angle, but also from the accuracy angle. Based on that review, you want to make any final updates in CALPADS before you certify the reports. So after everyone reviews them and says, yes, my part is good to go, it feels correct, then your CALPADS administrator can approve the reports. Do know that the EOI 3 and 4, those do require self-approval. But once you hit those buttons, you are done with your EOI submission. Last but not least, here are your timelines and milestones. These align with what the state recommends as well. What you should be working on during most of the month of June is just kind of submitting those file types we discussed today, or we went over today, looking at those discrepancies, resolving the errors, reconciling the information. And then kind of late June, early July, continue to resolve errors, but review those snapshot reports and make those final updates. You should definitely be reviewing those snapshot reports and allow yourselves enough time to review them adequately. It's not something that you want to send the night before it's due or the day before it's due or the day before certification is due, because that doesn't give teams enough time to really review all of the elements of those reports. July 11th is the date the state recommends to have 0 errors. Depending on your school and your size, I try to always bump it back a little bit. If I'm a K-8 school or an elementary school and my last day of school was, in early June, then I would love to have my stuff completed by the end of June. Also, when you're thinking about this date for 0 errors and the whole cycle, keep in mind people who you might need to be part of the process who might be going off of contract or on vacation, out for the summer, whatever the case is, because you might need to work around those dates as well. Then that last week before submission, you want to send it up to your leaders and other administrators for approval. And then the actual certification deadline is on July 25th. There is a very small amendment window from the 26th to August the 8th. You try not to use that, but if there's something that happens and you don't have time to fix it or you don't realize there was a mistake until after the 25th, there is a little window for you to resubmit and amend that data. That's it for me. I hope that you enjoyed the end-of-year CALPADS submission journey that we experienced today, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.